The sentence landed quietly, without the spectacle many expected, yet its weight rippled far beyond the courtroom walls. Rob Reiner's daughter stood at the center of a moment no one in Hollywood ever imagines for themselves, where legacy, grief, and accountability collided in a single breath. For years, the Reiner name had been associated with laughter, iconic films, and stories that shaped generations. Now it was being spoken in hushed tones, attached not to premieres or tributes, but to a verdict that marked an ending. Those seated inside the courtroom described an atmosphere stripped of drama, heavy with restraint, as if everyone understood that nothing said aloud could soften what had already been decided. This was not about shock anymore. It was about finality. Outside, the world struggled to reconcile two versions of the same family. One existed in memory, framed by red carpets and decades of creative influence. The other existed in the present, defined by court documents, sealed records, and a sentence that would forever alter how that name was spoken. Observers noted that there was no outburst, no visible collapse. Instead, there was a stillness that felt intentional, the kind that comes when a person has exhausted every argument with fate. It was that stillness that made the moment unsettling. It suggested acceptance rather than resistance, and acceptance carries its own kind of pain. What made the case resonate so deeply was not just who it involved, but how familiar the emotional terrain felt. Families everywhere recognized the tension between love and consequence, between protecting one's own and acknowledging harm. The proceedings had unfolded slowly, methodically, avoiding theatrics. Legal language replaced emotional language, and yet emotion lingered in every pause. When a sentence was read, it did not arrive like a blow. It arrived like a door closing, firm and irreversible. Those present said you could feel it, the collective understanding that this chapter could not be rewritten. For Rob Reiner, a man who built his career telling stories about connection and humanity, the moment carried an irony that was impossible to ignore. He did not speak publicly that day. He did not need to. His silence echoed louder than any statement ever could. Friends close to the family later said that this silence was not avoidance, but respect for the gravity of what had occurred. In moments like these, words risk becoming decoration, and decoration has no place in a room built for judgment. The sentencing itself was precise. No flourish, no commentary beyond what the law required. It acknowledged actions, consequences, and a future reshaped by both. It also marked a boundary, one separating the public's appetite for narrative from the court's obligation to fact. This distinction mattered. For weeks, speculation had swirled, fueled by incomplete information and emotional assumptions. Inside the courtroom, speculation had no currency. Only evidence and procedure held value. And that reality stripped the moment of illusion as the news spread. Reactions fractured along predictable lines. Some focused on sympathy, others on accountability. Many struggled to hold both at once. That struggle became part of the story itself. Social media, filled with arguments framed as certainty, despite the complexity that the legal process had laid bare. What was lost in that noise was the quiet truth that sentencing is never a victory. It is a conclusion, and conclusions are rarely clean. Those who watched the family leave described a scene devoid of drama. No rushing cameras, no shouted questions. Just a small group moving forward because there was no other direction left. It was there, in that unremarkable exit, that the meaning of the moment crystallized. This was not about punishment as spectacle. It was about consequence as reality in the days that followed. Attention shifted toward legacy. Could decades of creative contribution coexist with a moment of personal tragedy without one erasing the other? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, appeared to be yes. Legacy does not disappear when pain enters the frame. It becomes more complicated, more human. And perhaps that is the hardest part for audiences accustomed to simple narratives to accept. What remained undeniable was that the sentence marked a final goodbye to the version of life that existed before the courtroom doors closed. It closed a chapter not just for one individual, but for an entire family whose private struggle had become public property. Yet even in that exposure, there was a boundary the law maintained, reminding everyone that some truths belong only to those who live with them. In the end, the moment will not be remembered for raised voices or dramatic gestures. It will be remembered for its restraint, for the way it forced a reckoning without offering resolution, for the quiet acknowledgement that justice does not heal, it only defines, and for the realization that even the most familiar names are not shielded from the same endings that shape every human story. The days after the sentence felt longer than the months that led up to it, stretching time in a way grief often does. News outlets moved on quickly, but within the Reiner family, nothing moved at all. Each morning arrived with the same reality, unchanged and unchangeable. Those close to them described a strange disconnect between the speed of public attention and the slowness of private processing. The world had consumed the story, debated it, and archived it, while the people living inside were still learning how to breathe around the absence it created. That contrast became one of the quiet burdens no one could see. Friends noticed that Rob Reiner retreated further from public view, not out of shame, but out of necessity. Grief, when layered with responsibility, becomes heavy in a way few are prepared for. He had spent a lifetime shaping narratives for audiences, yet now he faced a story that could not be edited, reframed, or softened. Those who reached out said he listened more than he spoke, acknowledging support with gratitude, but rarely elaborating. It was as if speaking risked turning something deeply personal into something consumable, and that line had already been crossed too many times. The sentence itself continued to ripple through conversations about justice and family loyalty. Legal analysts weighed in, emphasizing that the outcome reflected process rather than emotion. They pointed out that sentencing is the endpoint of evidence, not a referendum on love. Still, the human instinct to interpret punishment through emotional lenses proved hard to resist. People wanted the story to resolve neatly, to declare villains and victims in clear terms. What they encountered instead was ambiguity, a reminder that real life rarely conforms to narrative comfort. Within the extended family, reactions varied quietly. Some focused on remembrance, choosing to honor what had been lost rather than dissect what had happened. Others struggled with anger, not always directed at a person, but at the reality that no decision could undo the damage. Mental health professionals observing the case from afar noted how often families in crisis are forced to navigate both compassion and accountability at once. That duality leaves no room for simplicity. It demands endurance rather than resolution. Public interest eventually narrowed to a single question: how does a family move forward after something like this? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is slowly and without certainty. There's no roadmap for reconciling love with consequence. There's only adaptation. Those close to the Reiners said their days became quieter, structured around small routines that offered stability where meaning felt fractured. Meals were shared, what were taken. Ordinary acts became anchors. The Hollywood community responded with restraint rather than spectacle. Colleagues sent private messages instead of public tributes, understanding that visibility was not what the moment required. That silence, much like the courtroom silence before the sentence was read, carried intention. It reflected an understanding that some moments lose their dignity when amplified. In an industry built on attention, choosing restraint was itself a statement. As weeks passed, the sentence became less of a headline and more of a background reality, something that existed without demanding explanation. The family did not issue updates. They did not clarify or defend. That absence of commentary frustrated some observers, but it also reinforced a boundary that had been missing earlier. Not every story belongs to the audience, even when the audience feels entitled to answers. What lingered most was not outrage or debate, but a sense of unfinished reckoning. Justice had spoken in its language, yet healing remained undefined. The sentence closed a legal chapter, but emotional chapters do not obey court calendars. They open and close unpredictably, sometimes revisiting pages long thought settled. In that way, the sentencing was both an ending and a beginning, a line drawn that forced everyone involved to imagine life beyond it. For those watching from a distance, the story served as an uneasy mirror. It challenged assumptions about fame as insulation, about success as protection. It reminded viewers that private pain does not disappear behind public achievement. If anything, it becomes more exposed. The Reiner family's experience, stripped of myth, revealed a truth that resonates far beyond celebrity. Accountability and love can coexist, but they do not cancel each other out. In the end, the days after the sentence taught a lesson no verdict ever announces outright. Closure is not something a judge delivers. It is something people assemble slowly from acceptance, memory, and the courage to continue living with unanswered questions. The Reiners, like countless families before them, were left to do that work quietly, away from cameras, one ordinary day at a time. As the weeks turned into months, the sentence began to reshape not only daily life, but memory itself. Moments from the past took on new tones, as if hindsight had adjusted their volume. Ordinary recollections became charged with meaning, while others faded quietly, unable to survive the weight of what followed. People close to the family said this was the hardest part, realizing that memory does not remain neutral after loss. It reorganizes itself, often without permission, pulling certain moments forward and pushing others away. In that shifting landscape, grief became less about what was gone and more about how the past was now understood. Rob Reiner's public silence continued, and with it came speculation that never fully disappeared. Some interpreted the quiet as avoidance, others as dignity. Those who knew him best rejected both interpretations. They said the silence was practical. Speaking invited interpretation, and interpretation invited distortion. After a lifetime spent crafting narratives, he understood how easily meaning could be bent once it left the speaker's control. This time, he chose not to participate in that process. It was a decision rooted not in fear, but in preservation. The legal outcome remained fixed, yet conversations around it evolved. Early reactions focused on the shock of the sentence itself. Later discussions turned inward, questioning how families identify warning signs, how much responsibility can reasonably be carried by parents, and where the limits of intervention truly lie. Mental health advocates pointed to the case as an example of how untreated or inadequately addressed issues can compound over time, especially when layered with pressure, expectation, and unresolved conflict. Still, they cautioned against simplifying the story into a lesson with a single takeaway. Real situations, they said, resist reduction. Behind closed doors, routines continued to do quiet work. Meals were planned. Errands were run. Life insisted on its ordinary rhythm, even when meaning felt suspended. Those simple acts became proof of survival rather than signs of recovery. Recovery implied improvement. Survival only required endurance. For a family navigating the aftermath of sentencing, endurance was enough. Public interest never fully vanished, but it thinned, becoming less intense and more periodic. Anniversaries, court dates, and unrelated news cycles occasionally pulled the story back into view. Each time it resurfaced, it felt less like breaking news and more like a reminder of something unresolved. Viewers who encountered it later often reacted differently, with less shock and more reflection. Time had softened the edges without erasing the impact. One unexpected effect of the sentence was the way it reframed conversations about legacy. People who once spoke of Rob Reiner solely through his work began acknowledging the complexity of the man behind it, not as a judgment, but as recognition. Greatness and pain were no longer treated as opposites. They existed in the same frame, challenging the assumption that success insulates against private collapse. That realization unsettled some and comforted others. It made the story more human, even as it remained tragic. The daughter at the center of the sentence became less visible as well. Once the legal process concluded, there was little reason for continued exposure. Her name appeared less frequently, often only in context rather than focus. That disappearance was not an erasure, but a return to anonymity shaped by consequence. In many ways, it marked the most final aspect of the sentencing. Attention moved on, but time did not. Those who followed the case closely often remarked on how little closure it offered. There was no revelation that made everything make sense, no confession that answered every question. The sentence resolved legality, not meaning. That distinction lingered, leaving observers with a quiet discomfort they could not easily dismiss. Perhaps that discomfort was the point. Some stories resist satisfaction because satisfaction would require a simplicity that reality does not provide. Within the family, grief remained private and uneven. Different members processed it at different speeds, sometimes in conflicting ways. There was no shared timeline for acceptance. There was only a shared history that could not be undone. That history, complicated and painful, continued to bind them together even as it hurt in the broader cultural landscape. The case faded into a larger pattern of stories that surface briefly and then recede. Yet for those who paid attention, it left a residue, a reminder that justice is not a cure and sentences are not endings. They are markers along a path that continues whether anyone is watching or not. Time continued its quiet work, reshaping the story without asking permission from those who remembered it differently. What once felt raw began to feel distant, not because the pain had diminished, but because living demanded forward motion. People close to the family said that this phase was marked by contradiction. On some days, the weight felt lighter, almost manageable. On others, it returned without warning, triggered by something small and ordinary. A familiar song, a passing comment, a memory that surfaced uninvited. Grief, they learned, did not fade in a straight line. It moved in circles, sometimes overlapping with moments of calm in unsettling ways. The sentence, though unchanged, began to occupy a different place in conversation. It was no longer spoken with urgency, but with reflection. Legal scholars revisited the case as an example of how the justice system balances evidence with restraint. They noted the absence of spectacle, the deliberate pacing, and the narrow focus on facts. In a media environment often driven by outrage, the process itself became part of the lesson. Justice does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks procedural, quiet, and unsatisfying to those who crave emotional resolution. For the family, this procedural ending contrasted sharply with their internal reality. There was no equivalent process to follow, no clear steps toward closure. They navigated instead by instinct, learning when to speak and when to remain silent. Holidays arrived with altered meanings, marked less by celebration and more by reflection. Traditions were kept or abandoned depending on how they felt in the moment. Nothing was fixed. Everything was provisional. Public curiosity slowly shifted away from the details of the case and toward broader questions it raised. How much can parents truly know about their children? Where does responsibility end and autonomy begin? These questions echoed far beyond the Reiner name, resonating with families who recognized fragments of their own experiences in the story. That resonance, quiet but persistent, gave the case a longevity that headlines alone could not sustain. Rob Reiner's work inevitably re-entered public discussion, but in a changed context. Films once viewed purely as entertainment were re-examined through the lens of personal loss. Themes of connection, misunderstanding, and reconciliation took on added weight. Critics debated whether it was fair to read personal tragedy into creative work. Some argued it enriched interpretation. Others cautioned against conflating art with biography. The debate itself reflected the difficulty of separating a person from the stories they tell. The daughter's sentence remained a fixed point amid this shifting landscape. It was referenced less frequently, but when it was, the language had softened. Words like final and inevitable replaced earlier expressions of shock. This linguistic shift signaled a broader acceptance that nothing more would be added to the legal record. What remained was lived experience, resistant to documentation and immune to analysis. Those who had followed the case from the beginning often described a sense of unresolved empathy. They felt compassion without clarity, sorrow without certainty. This emotional ambiguity unsettled some, who preferred stories that delivered clear moral lessons. Yet others recognized the ambiguity as honest. Life, they noted, rarely offers clean conclusions. It offers only consequences and the ongoing task of living with them. Within the family, communication evolved. Some conversations became easier, others more guarded. There were topics that could be approached directly and others that remained unspoken, not out of denial, but out of mutual understanding. Silence, once heavy, became functional. It allowed space where words would only reopen wounds. In that silence, relationships adjusted, finding new shapes that could accommodate what had happened as time passed. The story's cultural imprint softened, but its emotional imprint did not disappear. It lingered as a quiet reference point, a reminder that justice operates within limits and that human lives extend beyond those limits. The sentence marked an ending, but it did not define what followed. That definition remained in the hands of those who lived with its consequences every day. Ultimately, the case left behind no single message, only a collection of questions that resisted resolution. Perhaps the resistance was its most enduring feature. It refused to become a parable or a cautionary tale. It remained a human story, marked by loss, responsibility, and the uneasy coexistence of love and consequence. As the narrative settled into its quieter phase, attention turned toward how stories like this are remembered once the urgency fades. Not through headlines or verdict summaries, but through fragments carried forward by those who witnessed them closely. In the Reiner family's case, memory became selective, not by choice, but by necessity. Certain details were allowed to rest, while others lingered, returning at unexpected moments. This selective remembering was not an attempt to rewrite the past, but a way to survive it. Memory, after all, is not an archive. It is a living thing, shaped by emotion and time. Observers who revisited the case months later often remarked on how differently it felt. What once seemed overwhelming now appeared restrained, almost muted. The absence of new developments made room for reflection rather than reaction. Commentators noted that this shift revealed something uncomfortable about public attention. It thrives on momentum, not meaning. Once momentum slows, meaning is left for individuals to confront on their own. In that sense, the end of public interest was not a failure of awareness, but an inevitability of scale. Personal tragedy cannot compete indefinitely with the next story waiting to unfold. Within the family, the long-term effects of a sentence became more apparent. Relationships adjusted not through dramatic confrontations, but through subtle changes in proximity and communication. Some bonds strengthened through shared understanding, while others became quieter, defined more by respect for distance than closeness. There was no single emotional outcome. Each relationship found its own equilibrium, shaped by individual thresholds for grief and acceptance. That unevenness, though challenging, allowed authenticity. No one was forced into a unified response. The legal finality of the sentence also influenced how responsibility was discussed. Early conversations often circled around blame, intent, and causation. Over time, those discussions gave way to broader considerations of prevention, intervention, and the limits of control. Experts emphasize that while accountability is essential, it does not erase the need for earlier support systems. The case became a reference point in discussions about how families, institutions, and communities respond to warning signs, particularly when those signs are complicated by privilege, access, or reputation. Rob Reiner's presence in public life remained minimal, yet when it occurred, it was marked by a different tone. Those who encountered him described a gentleness that felt earned rather than performative. There was no attempt to reclaim narrative dominance or reshape public perception. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement that some experiences permanently alter how a person occupies space. That change was not framed as loss alone, but as transformation, subtle and ongoing. The daughter's absence from public discourse became increasingly complete. With the legal process concluded, there was little incentive for continued exposure. This disappearance underscored a reality often overlooked during high-profile cases. Sentencing does not just impose consequence. It also removes a person from the public imagination, returning them to a private existence defined by structure and limitation. That transition, abrupt and absolute, is rarely examined, yet it is one of the most consequential aspects of justice. For audiences who continued to reflect on the case, the lack of closure became a point of contemplation rather than frustration. Some recognized that the discomfort they felt was a mirror of reality rather than a flaw in the story. Not all harm can be neatly categorized or fully explained. Accepting that truth requires a tolerance for ambiguity that modern media rarely encourages. Yet here, ambiguity persisted, resisting reduction. The family's decision to remain private reinforced a boundary that had been tested repeatedly. It signaled an understanding that healing does not benefit from constant exposure. This choice, while unsatisfying to those seeking answers, preserved a space where grief could exist without performance. In an era where visibility is often equated with validation, choosing invisibility became an act of care. As the months accumulated, the sentence transformed from an event into a reference point. It marked a before and after, not just in chronology, but in identity. Life did not return to what it had been. It reorganized itself around what was now unavoidable. That reorganization, gradual and uneven, reflected a truth often ignored in public discourse. Justice may conclude, but impact continues. What remained most striking was how ordinary life persisted alongside extraordinary loss. Grocery trips were taken. Conversations drifted to mundane topics. Laughter, unexpected and sometimes unwelcome, still occurred. These moments did not diminish the seriousness of what had happened. They affirmed the resilience required to continue living when resolution is impossible. That I end this way. The story's lasting significance did not lie in the sentence itself, but in what followed it, in the quiet endurance of those affected, in the unresolved questions left behind, and in the reminder that some goodbyes are not marked by ceremony, but by the slow acceptance that life, altered and imperfect, must still be lived. As the first year approached its close, the sentence took on a different kind of permanence. It was no longer something to be processed or debated, but something to be lived alongside. Anniversaries carry a particular weight in stories like this. They act as quiet reminders, not demanding attention, but impossible to ignore. For the Reiner family, these milestones arrived without ceremony. There were no public acknowledgments, no statements marking the passage of time. The absence of recognition was itself meaningful. It suggested an understanding that time passing does not equate to healing, only to distance. Those who remained close described a growing emphasis on boundaries, not as walls, but as necessary definitions of what could and could not be shared. Conversations became more intentional. Some subjects were approached gently, others avoided entirely. This was not avoidance born of fear, but discernment born of experience. Pain had taught them what exposure cost. Privacy, once assumed, had become something to actively protect. The broader public, meanwhile, encountered the story less frequently, often through secondary references rather than direct coverage. A passing mention, a retrospective line. Each appearance felt less charged than before, stripped of urgency and spectacle. Yet for those who noticed, these moments carried a subtle gravity. They served as reminders that some outcomes do not fade simply because attention shifts elsewhere. The sentence remained intact, unchanged by time or distraction in academic and professional circles. The case began to appear in discussions about the limits of narrative framing. Analysts pointed out how early coverage sought coherence where none existed, attempting to impose structure on a situation defined by complexity. Over time, the absence of a clean narrative became the story's defining feature. It resisted simplification, forcing observers to confront discomfort rather than resolve it. In that resistance, it offered a rare honesty. Rob Reiner's legacy continued to exist in parallel with this reality. His work was still referenced, celebrated, and revisited, but always with an added layer of awareness. This layering did not diminish the art itself. If anything, it deepened engagement, reminding audiences that creators are shaped by lives that extend beyond their work. The separation between public contribution and private suffering proved thinner than many preferred to believe. The sentence also reframed how compassion was discussed. Early reactions often leaned toward extremes, either excusing behavior through context or condemning it without nuance. With time, those extremes softened. Conversations became less reactive, more contemplative. People began to acknowledge that understanding is not the same as absolution, and empathy does not negate accountability. This shift, subtle but significant, reflected a maturation in how the story was held. For the daughter at the center of the sentence, life had narrowed dramatically, defined by routine and restriction. This narrowing, though rarely discussed, represented the most tangible outcome of the legal process. Sentences are often spoken of in abstract terms, measured in years or conditions. Lived reality, however, unfolds day by day, shaped by repetition rather than milestones. That reality remained largely unseen, as it often does, hidden behind institutional walls and procedural language. The family's adaptation continued quietly. Support systems adjusted. Relationships evolved. There were moments of connection that surprised them, appearing without warning and offering brief relief. There were also moments of heaviness that arrived just as unexpectedly. This unpredictability became part of the new normal. It taught patience, not as virtue, but as necessity. What many observers came to recognize was that the story's power lay not in its resolution, but in its aftermath. Sentencing provided an endpoint for the court, but not for the human experience that followed. That experience resisted summary, existing instead as a series of adjustments, compromises, and quiet decisions made away from public view. It was in those unseen choices that the true weight of the sentence was carried. AS attention continued to wane. The story's presence shifted from public discourse to personal reflection. Those who remembered it did, so not because they were reminded, but because it had lodged itself in their understanding of how fragile and complicated human lives can be. It challenged assumptions about control, protection, and inevitability. It left behind not answers, but awareness. In this quieter phase, the finality of a sentence became clearer, not as an ending that resolved everything, but as a line that could not be crossed back over. Life moved forward on one side of it, permanently altered. That alteration did not announce itself loudly. It simply existed, shaping choices and perceptions in subtle ways. Ultimately, the case endured not as a headline, but as a reference point for complexity. It reminded those who encountered it that justice operates within limits, and that human stories continue long after those limits are reached. The sentence marked a conclusion in law, but in life, it marked the beginning of a different, more difficult chapter, one defined by endurance rather than explanation. The final stretch of this story does not arrive with revelation or closure, but with recognition. Recognition that some outcomes are permanent, and some questions remain unanswered not because they were overlooked, but because they have no clean answers. As time continued to pass, the sentence settled into history, no longer current, no longer urgent, yet never erased. It existed as a fixed point that quietly influenced everything around it. For the Reiner family, this meant learning how to live alongside something that could not be changed, only acknowledged. What became clear in this last phase was how profoundly the absence of spectacle shaped the meaning of the ending. There was no dramatic confession, no public reckoning, no moment that redefined the narrative in a single stroke. Instead, the story concluded the way many real stories do, with paperwork finalized, routines resumed, and attention redirected elsewhere. That ordinariness was not anticlimactic. It was honest. It reflected the reality that justice systems conclude cases, but human lives absorb them slowly, unevenly, and often invisibly. Those who reflected on the case long after the sentence noticed that their own reactions had changed. Initial certainty softened into humility. Strong opinions gave way to quieter contemplation. The story no longer felt like something to debate, but something to sit with. It prompted questions rather than answers, encouraging reflection on family dynamics, mental health, responsibility, and the limits of intervention. These were not questions with satisfying conclusions, but they lingered precisely because of that. For Rob Reiner, the finality of the sentence marked a boundary he did not cross publicly. His legacy continued, but it did so without commentary on this chapter of his life. That restraint became part of the ending itself. It signaled an understanding that some experiences are not meant to be shaped into statements or lessons for others. They are meant to be endured privately, with dignity and care. The daughter's sentence remained what it was, unchanged by reflection or reinterpretation. It did not grow lighter with time, nor did it expand beyond its original scope. It simply existed, shaping a future defined by structure and limitation. That reality, stark and unembellished, underscored the difference between narrative and consequence. Stories evolve. Sentences do not. As the public moved on, the case found its place among countless others that briefly command attention before fading from view. Yet for those directly affected, there was no fading, only adaptation. Life reorganized itself around what could not be undone. This reorganization was not dramatic. It was incremental, composed of small decisions made daily, often without conscious thought. In that way, the ending was not marked by an event, but by a gradual acceptance that life would continue in a different shape. The final goodbye implied by the sentence was not spoken aloud. It existed in the quiet acknowledgement that the past could not be revisited and the future would unfold under new constraints. It was a goodbye to assumptions, to expectations, and to the idea that love alone can prevent harm. That realization was painful, but was also grounding. It replaced illusion with truth that in the end, the story resolved not into clarity, but into reality. A reality where accountability and compassion coexist without canceling each other out. Where justice defines boundaries but does not heal wounds. Where families endure losses that never fully translate into words. This was not a conclusion designed to satisfy an audience. It was a conclusion that reflected life as it is, incomplete, imperfect, and ongoing. And so the story ends not with certainty, but with understanding. Not with answers, but with awareness. A final goodbye, not to a person alone, but to a version of life that no longer exists. What remains is what always remains after such endings. Memory, consequence, and the quiet determination to keep moving forward, even when the path offers no resolution.